It is a great honor and a privilege to introduce Asher Cailingold, the author of really a remarkable book, The Unlikely Heroine, Esther Cailingold's Fight for Jerusalem. Who was your sister?
She was my late sister, yes. There were three of us in the family. Esther was the eldest. And then there was, the middle one is Mimi, who was married to the late Yuda Avner, great friend of mine besides my brother-in-law. And I was the youngest, I was the kid in the family. And Esther and I had a very special relationship, which I think was strengthened in the Second World War when the Nazis were bombing London. And our father, our dad, was working on what you call civil defense. He had twice a week he had to be on duty. So he trained us how to deal with firebombs that the Germans were dropping. And Esther and I would watch out for this, because if it caught onto the house could have burnt down. And we would go out with a pump and a pail of water and put out these bombs. And then we began a relationship in which she introduced me to literature, to classical music.
And how old were you at the time?
Well, I was probably 10 or 11 years old.
And this was in London?
1940, 1941.
This was in London?
During the Blitz, when the Germans were bombing Britain in night after night, and during the day too. So this is where a special relationship, I think, grew up. And she influenced me a great deal in her life. And I think that the major feature of Esther's life was the desire to volunteer. And that's something which I respected very much. And that was, I think, something which she got from our family. Our grandfather, my mother's father, he used to have a slogan. I used to ask him, Zayda, where are you going? And he spoke in Yiddish. You know, where are you going to? And he used to always use the same expression, Ratten Yiden, saving Jews. And he was the sort of person that people used to come to. He was an older man, he was retired a long time ago. People used to come and ask his advice about family problems, about problems with children, about even things to do with medicine, you know, of what should I do, my wife do, etc., etc. And he always had this slogan of Ratten Yiden. But I think it was expressed even more deeply in my father's reputation as someone who he used to travel to, we were in London, and he used to travel to Europe several times a year, and mainly to Poland, to Warsaw, where he had an uncle, aunt and 7 cousins who were in the family business of booksellers and publishers, which was the family business. His own parents and his brothers and sisters all came in Aliyah in the 1920s.
From Warsaw, from Poland.
But because they saw the Germans behaving badly when they were in Warsaw in the First World War. And they said this, my grandfather of Toli Cailingold, he said there's no future for the Jews in Europe, 1920. And they all came in Aliyah. And this uncle didn't. He was influenced by some of the Rebbes. Pauline, this is where we stayed. My father used to travel there regularly, and he saw the rise of the Nazi movement, the Nazi party, the Nazi regime very early on, probably from the early 1930s, even before Hitler came to power. And he adopted this same slogan, Ratten Yiden, we have to do whatever we can to save Jews. And I was a kid, used to hear him talking about this, and I remember there was one expression, probably the first legal expression I ever heard, an affidavit. You have to sign affidavit. Affidavit was a legal document that said he, Moshe Cailingold, would be responsible for this or that other family who wanted to find a way out of Germany or Austria or Czechoslovakia, or in some cases Poland too. And he would sign documents saying, I would be responsible for them, etc., etc. And that, I think, is something that passed on to Esther very much, and to a certain extent come to me too. And it was no, I think, no accident that I went on to study social work, and I spent most of my career, the longest time of my career, working with New Orleans and working with Aliyah and helping people to settle into the country and so on and so forth. And I always had this in my mind. This is something I think I think, to do with the Rathaman Yidden. I have to just end this episode by saying that in my capacity, in my job, in the Aliyah department, the Jewish agency, with a British passport, I travelled to countries that normally Israelis don't travel to, including, in this case with my wife, on 2 occasions to the Soviet Union, where we met with the local activists, the refuseniks, the Hebrew teachers. Later on I went to Czechoslovakia and other places where we were able to...
This was before the Iron Curtain fell.
Oh, sure, during the time of the Iron Curtain, during the time of communists, where I would almost say that one of the things that we did was we, in a sense, bought you Jews, because if you knew who to pay a few $100s to, you could get out. And this is what actually happened. And we bought, amongst other things, we bought money. I remember there was a group of youngsters in Czechoslovakia who were desperate to get out. And the message came through to us in Jerusalem that they needed several $100s to bribe a certain official who would give them documents to leave, not, God forbid, to Israel, but it didn't really matter, as long as they could get out into the West somewhere, and they did. And I remember coming along with a large sum of money hidden under my clothing, and we couldn't even go to the kids' homes because their parents were absolutely, would object to it. They were communists. And we gave these youngsters money, and within a few weeks they arrived with us in Israel.
It was a very dangerous thing that you did.
In a sense, yes, in a sense. Had we been caught, we were always warned that we would be liable for prosecution. But I have to tell you, that was nothing new to me. One of my favourite possessions, if you can see it here, is an award to the Fighters for the State. I got this 10 years before I came on Aliyah. Well, I got it later on, but I got it from work that I did 10 years before I came on Aliyah, when the Haganah established a secret group in England in which I was involved. So I was a member of the Haganah already in 1947. Wow. A few of us was from the youth, Zionist youth movements, were sworn in as members of the Haganah. We were sworn to secrecy. We were warned that if we were caught by the British, we could be imprisoned for many years. And we helped whatever way we could by acquiring equipment, by recruiting volunteers, people who'd been experts in the Second World War, pilots, naval personnel, and so on and so forth, amongst the Jewish community, of course, by starting off the whole idea of guarding synagogues. The fascists in London were already very active. In England, in general, they had already been released after the war, and they were organising attacks on synagogues. 1947.
This is even after it came out what happened in the Shoah.
2 years after the Holocaust, sure. Wow. It was already beginning then, and unfortunately it's returning now. It's happening again. And so we young people were recruited, amongst other things, to guard the shuls, to guard the...
And actually, were you brought up in a very Zionistic religious family?
I would go further and say the first songs I remember learning were Zionist songs that we heard from our father at the Shabbos table. Wow. You see, this is another side of the story, influenced Esther enormously, which is very little known. My late grandfather, Naftali Cailingold, was a Karliner Chassid, but he was a Zionist. He was a delegate to the third Zionist Congress in Bratislava, I believe, sometime in the 10 or 12, and he was a real Zionist. And these people believed that the time had come to do whatever we can to build up a state for ourselves, and at the same time to put the Golas behind us, to forget. There's no hope for us there anymore. We're not supposed to be there anymore. It's very interesting. These were what you would call today Haredi or ultra-Orthodox Jews. I have a photograph of both grandfathers with beards and
he was Hasidic? He was...
Sure. He was a Karolina Chassid. Yeah. Originally from Pinsk, by the way, in Belarus. and they moved later on to Warsaw for business purposes via Vilna, and then they came on to Warsaw. My late father was a talmid at the famous Vilna yeshiva of the Gaon of Vilna, and then they settled for a while in Warsaw until my grandfather said, there's no hope for us here in Europe, it's finished for us, we're going to Aliyah. And my father was sent to London to open a branch of the business in 1920.
But originally he was
He was supposed to have come here, but he didn't. They sent him to London instead of to here. And he did that. He opened a branch of the business. He helped to get certificates for the family to be able to settle in Eretz Israel. And also he helped money-wise. The beginning situation was impossible. I mean, you know, a grandfather had a business and he started in Yerushalayim and he didn't work and he moved to Tel Aviv.
It was very difficult for him.
He had
in the early
a
days.
bookshop underneath the main shul on Alabi Street in Tel Aviv until he died in 1949. And my father helped him all the years, helped the family all the years. The family, thank God, all managed to settle down and they married and they had children, etc., etc., etc. But the beginning in those early days in the 1920s, people were literally starving here.
It was very difficult in the early yeshiva. Very difficult.
Sure.
Wow. And so you growing up, you always had this Zionism and combined with orthodoxy, with.
My decision to come on Aliyah must have been when I was about 9 or 10 years old. I don't know really, but I know
it was instilled in you.
You were going to come here. And as you say, Torah v'avodah, Zionism and religion were part of our.
It was an integral part of growing up. And for your sister as well, for both sisters.
But my sister couldn't wait. She literally couldn't wait. She was a student at London University, brilliant by the way. She went to one of the best girls' high schools in England.
Where did she study?
Pardon?
Where did she finish school in England?
She finished school in England. At a young age, by 17, she'd already finished school, went on to university. Within 2.5 years, she was already had a BA degree and a teacher's diploma. And then one Shabbos morning, we're sitting in a home and in London, and the postman arrives. My sister rushes out to get the post, and she comes back waving an envelope. And she says, I've got it, I've got it, I've got it. She'd read in a newspaper, in a Jewish newspaper, that they were looking for an English teacher, English and history teacher, at the Evelina de Rothschild School in Jerusalem. Evelina de Rothschild School was established by English Jews in honor and name of Lord Rothschild. And this was her confirmation that she got this job, which enabled her to receive a certificate from the British to come here, a working permit to come here and teach in this girl's
This was still, the white paper was still in effect.
1946.
1946.
Yeah. November, well, it was about the time of the Chagim in 1946, and she actually arrived here with my father in November 1946.
And your mother she was okay with her decision to come to
Oh,
Yerushalayim?
she was thrilled. It was a chagigah. It was a whole festival. I remember the Shabbos table of Esther got this job to teach in Yerushalayim of all places.
Because I must tell our listeners, the British put the brakes on. They closed the gates.
Absolutely.
And even those who survived the horrors of the Shoah, they were forbidden from entering in those days it was under mandatory Palestine.
That's right.
So it was a big deal to get this certificate.
That's right. Which reminds me of a story that happened to me a few years ago. Since I retired for the past 20-something years, I've been volunteering as a guide in Yad Vashem in the Holocaust Memorial Museum. The last few years I've been taking mainly VIP guests. And I remember once, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I had a British general who came to Yad Vashem, and we were waiting for him to arrive, and one of the people waiting for him was the British ambassador, and the British military attaché in Israel, who happened to be a woman, an officer. And with them there was obviously the Israeli representative too, including a young girl, a young officer, who had come on Aliyah from Britain not long before. And she knew Hebrew well, and of course she knew English well, and the army was using her as a liaison with the VIP guests. And this woman, this British officer, the military attaché, asked a strange question. As she saw this girl there in a uniform, she said, "What's your attitude to girls serving in the army?" So I said, "Well, you happen to have asked the wrong person." "Why?" She said, "Because I'll tell you the story of my late sister." Wow. And this former English girl, this Israeli officer, said, "What was your sister's name?" And I said, my sister's name was Esther." "What? You're the brother of Esther Cailingold?" I said, "Yes, I'm her brother." And she went white, and I swear she nearly fainted. And I said, "Well, why are you so surprised?" She said, "Because I've just finished reading the book by Yehuda Avner, in which he mentions this girl from England who became, after she was killed, but became in a sense his sister-in-law, because she married her sister. He married her sister. And she just couldn't believe that she'd met her brother. So there you get these strange things. Now, when the general came, and this is continuation of what you just mentioned before, I always bring these British VIPs when the end of the museum in Yad Vashem in front of this huge picture of the Exodus. Yeah. And I said, "General, I want you to watch this picture, to look at this huge photograph, or the smaller one with Jews behind barbed wire on Cyprus. And remember that on that ship, that tiny boat, there were 4,500 Holocaust survivors, and they were dragged off the boat by British Marine commandos and sent back to Hamburg in Germany and put into 2 camps, I call them concentration camps, guarded by British troops." And he looked at me in shock, and he said to me, "I've only one question to ask you. Will you be able to forgive us for what you did in the same way as what you forgave the Germans?" And I stopped also in horror, and I said, "You must be mistaken. We have no arguments now with your generation, with the grandchildren of the Nazis, but we'll never forget what they did to our people in the Second World War, and we'll never forgive your government and your country for what you did to our Holocaust survivors and others who tried desperately to come to find a homeland after the Second World War." And there was a sense of silence, and that was the end of the tour.
But Asha, I just want to mention, there were 100 very, very important rabbis, and it was Rabbi Herzog pleaded with the British to allow them to come in. This was before the Shoah. And because of the white paper, they refused.
They absolutely refused.
And a lot of those rabbis, before the Shoah, and a lot of those rabbis...
This was after the Shoah.
I know, but a lot of, because of the British
white
paper and the very forceful rejection of allowing Jews to come to Palestine, mandatory Palestine, they died in Europe.
I will say this for the British, which you can't really say for the Americans. Roosevelt said, "We have a quota and not one more above the quota." I can say for the British that 85,000 Jews found haven in Britain before the outbreak of the Second World War, including 10,000 children on
the kinder transport.
And they said, "Look, I've got a neighbour just across the way here who's one of the kinder transport that has children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren." You know, we have a saying in Judaism, "He who saves one life is as if he saved the entire world." Yeah. And if they save 10,000 children, you can say they saved 10,000 generations.
And a lot of those kinder transport actually went to non-Jewish families in England as well.
Unfortunately.
Under difficult situations.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah. Wow, so you're amazing. What a story. You heard it. Your brother-in-law, you heard Avner, that he wrote it, but you wrote it in your book, and here's the book that you wrote, The Unlikely Heroine. And if we can just show for our listeners this incredible book, and I've been very privileged. I received the book when it first came out, and I really would recommend it for everybody to read. I think it is just... it's just a masterpiece what you did.
Thank you.
And it's the whole story of your dear sister and her sacrifice.
Thank you.
How did you, can I just ask you, Asha, how did your sister get involved in, she came to teach at Evelina, and then how did she get involved in the Haganah or in...
Well, I would say two things influenced her very strongly. First of all, obviously, it was at the background of volunteering, you know, wherever I'm needed most, sort of thing. But I think there were two things which we found expressed very much in the letters that she wrote home. One was a sense of disappointment, even anger, at the people in the school. The school was very much an English-influenced school. The first language was English. The girls, of course, were local girls and they spoke Hebrew at home. But the idea of the school was to anglicize them, and they were very much, if you like, supportive of the British government at the time, the Mandatory government. And she found this disgusting. And she became more and more disillusioned with the school. And she even asked in her letters, what am I doing teaching English to these girls here when look what's happening around me? And what's happening around her was the disgusting behaviour of the British, particularly the British Army, the British troops. She mentions at one point in one of her letters, a man was, older man, a Jew, an Orthodox Jew, was walking across Strauss Street in Jerusalem, a main street in Jerusalem, and a drunken British soldier assaulted him, and his rifle went off and he killed this man.
Wow. It
later transpired that my son-in-law, my daughter's husband, it was his grandfather. We put this bit together years later. Who was, by the way, my son-in-law is 11th generation Jerusalemite. So this old man was 9th generation Jerusalemite. He was a real old timer. The people came here at the beginning of the 19th century. You know, 100 years before Herzl. He's one of those who came here, you know, the real pioneers. And a drunken British soldier. Now she read this in the paper, she heard these things, and it annoyed her enormously. And she decided to start volunteering for the Haganah. Now, it took stages. Her first job in the Haganah was a fairly innocuous one, but an important one. You see, the British were out to stop all our activity in every sense of the term, but Haganah was already active. And towards evening, early evening, the boys would go on duty, on guard duty, and of course they weren't allowed to carry weapons. If they were caught with weapons, it would be the end for them. They could spend years in prison. So they adopted an idea that the boys would go towards the post where they were going to do guard duty with one of the girl volunteers, and she would hide the weapon under her clothing. So that was the first job, to accompany a boy going on guard duty and hide the weapon under clothing. But that wasn't good enough for her. And then she heard that they were looking for people to cook in the outposts in the round about Jerusalem. And obviously they were looking for Fumgos because they wanted to, already then, before the state was established, certainly today, but Sal, they wanted to make sure the food was kosher so that, I'm sorry, people who had volunteered for the Haganah, who were Datim, who were religious, could eat there and so on. So she was posted initially to two outposts. One was a place called Suba, which was an Arab village. Now there's a kibbutz there called Kibbutz Tova, on the old road to Tel Aviv. And the next place was Neve Yaakov, which at that time, today is a suburb of Jerusalem. At that time it was an isolated outpost on the outpost. And she went there, and in both cases these outposts were attacked by Arabs. And she felt very frustrated that all she was doing was cooking when the places were being attacked. You know, what she could do, she hadn't had any training, so the girls had to sort of hide. And she persuaded the boys to teach her how to use a weapon. And it transpired, not surprisingly, that she turned out to be an expert sniper. And every time the outposts were attacked, she would take a rifle and do what she had to do with the rifle. And of course they were very proud of her. Then came an order from the Haganah High Command that the girls would have a proper training session, which they did. They were brought back into Jerusalem to the Schneller camp here in Jerusalem, and they got a proper training session, but they were not going to be allocated anymore to any of the outlying outposts. And Esther again was given various duties. One of them was broadcasting on the Haganah radio in English, geared to the British soldiers and the British civilians who were on duty here, giving them our side of the story. So she was broadcasting every evening, and we even found in the when I was writing the book and I was doing research in the Army archives, I've even found some of the text of the material that she was reading. And again, she was raring to go, but they wouldn't let him go. And then one day, the message got around that the British would allow a group of teachers to go into the Old City, the Jewish quarter of the Old City. Now let me just put things in context. Jerusalem was under siege until Yitzhak Rabin and his commandos captured the castle and opened up the road. We couldn't get food or supplies in Jerusalem. There were small Piper planes that used to land on what's today Gan Saka, the Saka Park, but how much could they bring? And then we needed ammunition and we needed food supplies. But within the siege there was an inner siege, and that was the old city of Jerusalem, surrounded by British soldiers who would allow a convoy to come in once a week with essential supplies, which meant not ammunition but food. The message came out that the British would allow a group of teachers to go into the old city, to the Jewish quarter of the old city, because the day when they had introduced this siege, there were many parents who'd been working in West Jerusalem in the new city, and they weren't able to get back home. So the kids were running around wild, getting under everyone's feet. And they decided they'd allow a group of teachers to go in and to act as teachers. And of course she immediately put her name down, and she reported day after day with her backpack. By the way, Yehuda Avner was here at the time, and he was one of the people who witnessed this and gave us the details of all this, until one day, Erev Pesach 1948, well, a little while before Pesach, a convoy went in and she came into the old city and was immediately allocated, when they heard who she was and she'd had background experience and so on, battle experience, she was immediately allocated to be the liaison officer with one of the two sections of the Jewish quarter of the old city. And there she was. She would run on the rooftops bringing supplies, encouraging the boys, telling them to stay in their position, bringing ammunition, bringing food. At one time she was asked with one of the boys to go towards one of the gates where a sack of grenades had been dropped by a Palmach unit that had come to her to help them, and she went there and she was hit by a bullet in her thigh, was taken to the Misgavler Dach hospital, which was then in the old city. Her wounds were dressed and she was told to rest, but she refused to rest and she went back to her duties. And then very sadly, as the situation got worse and worse, because eventually the Arab Legion, led by British officers, invaded the country together with other Arab armies and moved towards the old city, and a bitter battle began, the last battle of the old city, and she, with a group of boys, was told to go towards an endangered outpost. She ran ahead, reached the building, and the Arab Legion blew up the building and she was buried under the debris and was very seriously wounded. And she was evacuated. And on the last night of the siege of the old city of Jerusalem, as they were being evacuated to Har Zion, to Mount Zion, she was lying there very badly wounded. And it was a Friday night. And there was no morphine, there was nothing to help her. She was in terrible pain, and one of the boys offered her a cigarette to help calm her down. And lying next to her in the stretcher was a man called Yeshua Cohen, who later became the chief rabbi of Haifa. He was the son of the famous Nazir of Jerusalem. And he gave us the evidence of her last words. And she looked towards this soldier and she put out her hand and she said, Lo Shabbat Hayom. No, no, Shabbat today. And she refused a cigarette. And as she was being evacuated on the stretcher that night, or towards the next morning, she died on the stretcher. And she was brought for burial here on Mount Zion, on Mount Herzl, where she is to this day, right near here.
So actually, it is, you know, the title of your book was Unlikely Heroine. She really is one of the great heroes of the Jewish people. She really is. To have volunteered, she could have had an easy life, like but she could have remained in England, and she didn't.
I have to stress as well that when she was killed, she was just a few weeks short of her 23rd birthday.
Wow, she had a whole life ahead of her.
Well, we don't talk about it too much because the children and the grandchildren ask, and we tell them whatever we can. But the one question we always ask ourselves is, what would have happened to her had she stayed alive? Because she was someone with a tremendous promise. Whoever knew her realised that she was someone who was going to be a leader, a highly intelligent young woman with tremendous motivation. One of her first letters when she arrived was a love letter, not to a boy but to the country. She fell in love with the country immediately. Everything was wonderful, although things weren't wonderful by any means. But wherever she went, and she travelled extensively all over the country, regardless of any problems or any. Wherever she went, she loved it. She went to Tirat Tzvi, and she went to Yavne, and she went to obviously we had family in Tel Aviv. She went to Tel Aviv. She went to Haifa. She went all over the country, and everywhere was wonderful. Everywhere was beautiful. Everywhere was the answer to a dream of 2,000 years. Here we are.
She was realising the dream.
Yeah.
How did your parents? They must have been devastated. It must have been so difficult for.
What I tell you,
when they heard the news, the tragic news.
It shattered my family, my parents. My father was a man who I always remember as a child was always full of humour. He always had jokes to tell at the Shabbos table and so on. But I remember he didn't smile once for the next 19 years. And after 19 years, in 1967, I heard that my father was very ill after I'd come back from the battles of the Golan Heights. And I'd always promised him that if he needed me, I would go back to England to help him. And he asked me to bring with a supply of tefillin and mezuzot, because during the war of 67 and the build-up to the war, he hadn't been able to get any supplies from Israel. And I remember going to a place in Meir Sha'arim and buying a supply of tefillin and mezuzot. And with that, I went to the Kotel, and from there straight to the plane. And when I got off the plane in London, there he was waiting for me with my mother. And I said, Abba, I've come to tell you that you were wrong and I was right. And he looked at me. I said, you always said that we'd never get back the Kotel, we'd never get back. And I said, but I've now come with these two rumors and here they are for you, straight from the Kotel on the plane here to London. And he smiled for the first time in 19 years. Sadly, he died a few weeks later. He was already a very sick man by then. So, in a sense, it rounded up.
Sure, that's really very emotional what you're saying. Wow.
It is. It is.
It's incredible. And here on your wall you have, there's a street named after your sister.
Yeah. So
this is in, it's by Oshishkin.
It's by Oshishkin, the entrance to the school where Esther taught the Evelyn de Rothschild School. I have to tell you, it took us all these years to persuade the Jerusalem municipality to name a street in Esther's memory, and it was our youngest son who was At that time, the Director of Education in Jerusalem, and worked closely with the mayor, who persuaded the naming committee of Jerusalem, a municipality, to name a street in her name. And we had a very moving ceremony a few months ago in Rehov Yusishkin, right round the corner from where my sister Mimi lives, and just minutes walk from where Esther lived in Rehov Rambam in Jerusalem. There's her name on the wall in the entrance to the school where she taught all those years ago.
Wow, and thank God they did it, and it's so fitting.
Yeah.
If I could just ask, if you could read what Yitzhak Nabon, the former president of Israel, wrote. It is so beautiful what he wrote about your sister and about the book. So on the bottom he writes,
I think it's the beginning.
or even he writes a little part over here.
The beginning.
It's condensed.
Yitzhak Nabon was the former president of Israel, and he writes as following: I commend this book as compulsory reading, especially for Jewish youngsters everywhere, for it is a very human and literary experience, a piece of living history in the struggle of the Jewish people for independence and sovereignty. Of course, he wrote this in Hebrew, and I wrote the book in English, but it was later on translated into Hebrew and is widely used, amongst others, by tour guides who take people around the old city and tell the story based on the book that I wrote about her.
Well, Asha, I cannot thank you enough. Really, you and your family are just people that we should all strive to emulate. Your love, devotion, commitment, and your sacrifice, what your family sacrificed for us being able to live in this very special country. It's really wonderful, and we are so appreciative. And thank you so much for the interview. I really appreciate it from the bottom of my heart.
I thank you so much, because this is another way that more people will hear the story of my late sister.
May her memory be for eternal blessing. It's such a great honor and a privilege to be with Asha Cailingold here in Jerusalem. And Asha, really, we've known each other for many years, and it's been always an honor and a privilege to know you and your dear family.
Leslie, thank you so much. And thank you for all your effort in bringing these ideas to a wider audience.
It's the greatest honor, really. Thank you.
Thank you.